If you have your Bible, and I hope you do, turn to Exodus. If you don't have your Bible, there are Bibles in the front pew racks in front of you. And if you don't own one, you can take that as a gift from the church. We're in a series through the book of Exodus, and Ralph has led us up to this point so far in the first two chapters. And today we're going to be in chapters 3 and 4. So Ralph asked me to do this because there's two chapters and he didn't want to have to do two chapters, and because Mila had her quinceañera and he was too busy. So he's like, I got to get somebody else to do this. So the topic, or if we had to just think about like the overarching what's going on in these two chapters, I think I could sum it up in the call of God comes to people who are unqualified. And so we're going to be thinking about the call of God, because this is a famous passage in the Bible where Moses comes to the burning bush and God calls him out of the burning bush. So this whole thing is about God's call to Moses, and we're going to look at the way God calls Moses to see what we can learn from that. Before we get into the passage, I want to talk a little bit about podcasts, because I'm a podcast junkie. You guys like podcasts? So, I have to commute all the way to Porterville 4 days a week, and part of what makes the commute worthwhile is that I get to listen to podcasts and audiobooks. And I was listening to this podcast a week and a half ago, and they were interviewing an astrophysicist, cosmologist, really smart, genius guy named Brian Keating. And Brian Keating has been writing books where he interviews Nobel Prize winners. And then the book is, each chapter is a different interview with a Nobel Prize winner to see what we can learn as normal people, what we can learn from Nobel Prize winners. Like there is some things that we can learn from them. They're not just so far above us that we can't learn anything from them. And what he noticed was, like, he's in academia. All of these Nobel Prize winners are in academia. And one of the common things among people who teach, do research, the smartest people in the world, is that they have imposter syndrome. And they feel like they don't measure up, that they don't have what it takes, and they doubt their own accomplishments. And he was talking to this one particular Nobel Prize winner, the one who won the prize in physics in 2017. His name's Barry Barish. And Barry Barish they were talking about imposter syndrome. He's like, oh yeah, I had that. Yep. And it got even worse after I won the Nobel Prize. And so he's like, what in the world's going on where a guy who's already accomplished the best in his field, like he's one of the best professors in the world, and he already had imposter syndrome, and then he wins the best prize in the world to show that he is the best physicist right now, and it got even worse. And he said, well, part of what happens when you win the Nobel Prize is you go to Sweden, and they throw a big party, and you meet the king and queen, and you eat this fancy reindeer dinner, and they give you $1 million, and they have this book, and you're supposed to sign your name in the book. And that book is the same book that they've used for over 100 years. So every Nobel Prize winner is in that book. And he starts flipping through to see all the people who have won the Nobel Prize for the last over 100 years. And he comes to Albert Einstein. And he's like, I don't belong in the same sentence as Albert Einstein. And so Brian Keating is like this guy who's an expert in Nobel Prize winners. He says, well, guess what? Albert Einstein had imposter syndrome too. The most famous, like if you don't know anything about science, you've heard of Albert Einstein. And the story is that Albert Einstein felt like he didn't measure up to his hero, Isaac Newton. And then he's like, Albert Einstein says, I don't belong in the same sentence as Isaac Newton. And so these geniuses who are smarter than we'll ever be feel like they don't measure up. They feel like they doubt their own accomplishments. They don't have what it takes. And I started thinking about this story of Moses, and I'm going to focus mostly on who Moses is and what he brings to the table, because I think that Moses probably had imposter syndrome too. where he felt like he didn't measure up. And I think he's got a lot in common with these people who have the best education. He's also kind of like a prodigal. So we know the story of the prodigal son. There's big differences. The prodigal son went off with his father's inheritance and blew it all and lived in luxury. Moses started out in luxury, but then he ended up in exile. So they're both in exile, working for taking care of other people's animals, and they both end up coming back. So the first point I want to make about Moses in this story of the burning bush is that God's call comes to the prodigals. So I've got several points, and you guys will. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from Alabama. I was raised in a Southern Baptist church, and so in the Southern Baptist church, you have to have points that have alliteration. So all of my main points have alliteration. So God's call comes to the prodigal, this sinful son that left home to squander his father's fortune. And now we've got Moses that we saw last week, who sinned and then had a self-imposed exile where he had to run away from Pharaoh, run away from his sin, and live in another land. So we come to our verses today in chapter 3. And last week we saw that Moses ended up in the wilderness of Midian. So I'm just going to read several of these verses and then we'll talk about them. We'll just go through verse by verse. So starting in chapter 3, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So the thing that struck me most about this passage is that Moses' fear. And I was wondering, why is Moses afraid? And why does it say that he became afraid when he became afraid? Because as I was thinking through this, I'm like, all right, so Moses is out in the countryside. He sees a burning bush that was not being consumed, which is very weird, and yet he wasn't afraid. And then when he goes over to see what's going on with this burning bush that's not being consumed, he hears a voice coming out of the fire, calling his name, and he's not afraid. He's just like, here I am, which is weird. It wasn't until the voice identifies itself as the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that Moses hid his face. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, why would he not be afraid until God identifies himself as the God of his fathers? And I think one of the reasons why he's probably afraid is that he had been on the run for 40 years for committing murder and running away from the consequences of his actions. And now he's faced with the God of the people he left. And he's like, my time has come. Like, God has come to punish me. I've been found out. And I think Ralph has done a good job of pointing out echoes throughout Exodus that point back to other parts of the story. And I think this is an echo back to the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve had sinned, God comes to them and they hid because they were afraid, because they knew they had sinned and they were ashamed of what they had done. And I think Moses is probably feeling the same thing right here. He's ashamed of what he's done, and he knows that God knows what he's done. Another reason that he's probably afraid is God's holiness. God identifies where he is holy ground, and he warns him, don't come near. This place is holy ground. Holiness means sacred, set apart, consecrated to God. And it signifies moral purity and perfection, which Moses definitely did not have. We know he's a murderer and he's running from the consequences of his actions, living and hiding from his past. And so he's probably afraid for this reason too. Like, he recognizes who God is, that God is holy and set apart, and he is not. And so we see that though Moses is hiding, God has other plans. In verse 7, the Lord says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land into a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So this is God's plans now. He's seen the misery of his people, and he comes to Moses in his shame and fear and calls him out. This had to have been shocking to Moses and probably confusing too. Like, I try to imagine Moses' face when he's feeling all this fear, and then God says, I'm calling you to go back to my people, to lead them out of slavery, to go back to where he has no honor, no esteem, to where he's not wanted by anyone. And his wheels are turning. And he's like, wait, what? You want me? And this makes his first question make sense. So Moses has a series of objections and excuses. God calls him, and this conversation between him and God is just Moses offering excuse after excuse. And the first one makes sense in this context. We see in verse 11, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He asks, who am I? And it's a legitimate question. It's a question that all of us have to ask at one point in our life. We spend so much time thinking about what we're supposed to do, and yet we can't figure out what we're supposed to do until we answer this question of who we are. And it's more than just like our vocation, whether we're like a doctor or a firefighter or a pastor or a teacher or whatever you are, because that part of your identity tells you what you're supposed to do. But it's deeper than that. It's something that tells you what you're supposed to do in every area of your life, whether you're at work or not. So who was Moses? At this point, he had spent the first 40 years of his life in Egypt. And at this point in the story, he had spent 40 years as a shepherd in Midian. So he was an elderly foreigner. He was 80 years old. He's laboring as a shepherd. Like, he probably didn't expect in his retirement to be taking care of someone else's sheep. As we saw in chapter 2 and 1 and 2, he was born a Hebrew, raised as a prince in Pharaoh's house, as his adopted grandson, and he probably didn't fit in anywhere. I mean, just think about it. Like, he's a Hebrew, he's adopted by the Egyptians, and he knew he wasn't an Egyptian, and everybody in Pharaoh's house knew he wasn't an Egyptian. And so he probably never felt like he fit in with his adopted family. And he didn't fit in with his blood relatives either, because he was too Egyptian for them. He was living in luxury while they were in slavery. And we saw last time when he tried to help them, they accused him and said, who made you ruler over us? Because he was being trained in Pharaoh's house to be a leader, and they rejected him. So he's rejected by his own people. He's rejected by Pharaoh after he killed the Egyptian. Pharaoh was trying to kill him. And now he's living in Midian, and he's not a Midianite either. So every place he's ever been, he's never belonged. And it gets even worse. In Genesis 46:34, when Joseph is bringing all of his family to the promised land, or to Egypt from the land of Canaan during the famine, they settle in the land of Goshen because they were shepherds. And Genesis 46:34 said that the Egyptians despised shepherds. So Moses, raised in an Egyptian family, probably had that prejudice too. And now he's in Midian as a shepherd. It must have been humiliating. So I think Moses is partly asking this question, who am I? But I think he's partly making a declaration. He's partly telling God, you got the wrong guy. Do you know who I am? I'm a murderer. I've never fit in anywhere. They've already rejected me once, so why am I supposed to go back to them again? The last time I tried to help, it was a disaster. They rejected me, and he probably is thinking, I don't blame them because I'm not one of them. But notice what God doesn't say. Verse 8, or excuse me, verse 12, yeah. God says, I will be with you. And this is the sign for you that I have sent for you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. Sometimes what the Bible doesn't say is just as important as what the Bible does say. So God doesn't say things like, oh, Moses, like, you're awesome, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and people like you. The old folks get that reference. He doesn't point out that Moses was he's actually fully qualified to lead. As a prince in Pharaoh's house, he would have been given the best education possible. The princes were educated in a way to make them leaders of the next generation. So he probably had all the classes and education and teaching and all of the best things that could have been taught back then, the best science, the best philosophy, the best politics, the best economics, the best leadership skills. He probably even had military training. No one in the world back then was probably more prepared than Moses was to be a leader. But God doesn't mention any of that. His response is, I will be with you. So the call of God comes to the prodigal, and we see Moses, who thinks he's unqualified. He's an outcast. He thinks nobody likes him. But it also comes with a promise that I will be with you. Moses was probably arrogant because of his, think about people who have a lot of education. It leads you to be puffed up a little bit. And he tried to do it all on his own, to lead the revolution, lead the people out of Egypt all alone, and take matters into his own hands. And this is part of why he was rejected by his own people. And it was also the reason why he was rejected by the Egyptians. But God's providence led him to a second education out in the wilderness, taking care of sheep. So he had the best that Egypt had to offer in Pharaoh's house. And now he's given a whole nother education, well, I think divinely inspired by God, to be a shepherd out in the wilderness. Think about what shepherds have to do. We already saw how this was probably humiliating for him. So he had to learn humility. But he had to learn how to care for weak sheep. Sheep are pretty dumb, and they're weak. He had to nurse the sick back to health. He had to seek after lost sheep. Sheep get lost. Sheep are stubborn, so he had to bear with stubborn sheep. And he had to protect them from wild animals. So he had 40 years in Pharaoh's school and 40 years in shepherd school. And so he was uniquely qualified now to be the one that God was going to choose. But God doesn't mention that. He doesn't tell him, oh, like, you know, you've got this. You've got all this stuff that you learned from being a shepherd. God's response is, I will be with you. Don't look at yourself and your own qualifications. Look at me, is what God says. I mean, Moses had already trusted in his own qualifications once, and look what happened. Look how that turned out. So the question is not really, who is Moses? The question is, who is Moses' God? So we've seen echoes in Exodus going to the past, back into Genesis, but this moment creates echoes that go into the future. And we see this over and over and over again. When God calls someone, he says, I will be with you. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 5, Joshua is getting ready to take over for Moses. And when God commissions him, he says, I will be with you. In Judges chapter 6, Gideon's being called to free the Israelites from their oppressors again. And the thing that God tells him is, I will be with you. In Jeremiah 1:8, when Jeremiah has been called, Jeremiah's only a teenager at this point, and his excuse is, I'm too young. And God doesn't mention any of that. He says, I will be with you. And then Jesus at the end of Matthew in the Great Commission, as he's ascending into heaven, he tells the disciples, I will be with you. So the call of God comes with this promise that when God calls us, he doesn't point to us and what we have to bring to the table. He points at himself and says, I will be with you. Now we get to the second excuse. So, I mean, if you have this information, God says, I will be with you. The next logical question to ask is, well, who is this that will be with me? And so Moses says in verse 13, says to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What am I supposed to say to them? So he's like, well, who are you, God? You say you're the God of my fathers, but Moses probably didn't have a whole lot of education into Israelite religion. Living in Egypt's house, he was probably raised in Egyptian religion. And so he knew that they had a different God, but he didn't really know who that God was. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this question and response because this one's worthy of a whole sermon in and of itself. So Ralph's going to talk about what God says to Moses here in this section. But part of his response is this observation that God sees the people in their suffering. And he recognizes what's going on in their life, and he's ready to do something about it. And so he says, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. And after that, he will let you go. Remember a few weeks ago, Ralph talked about recognizing what battle we're in and making sure that we're not fighting the wrong fight with the wrong weapons. And God is reminding Moses right here when he says, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt, and they will let you go. That the right battle, Moses fought the wrong battle the last time with the wrong weapons when he tried to kill the Egyptian. And at this point, the promise is, you don't have to fight anymore. I'm going to fight your battle for you. And it's not just going to be that I'm going to fight the battle for you and they're going to set you free. Because right after that, God promises, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. For each woman shall ask of her neighbor for silver and gold and for clothing, and so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So they're not going to have to go empty-handed. This would have been shocking too. In those days, the men would go out and fight the battle, and then the men would plunder their enemies. And so God's going to so thoroughly defeat the Egyptians and their gods that women will just go from door to door, and the Egyptians are just going to give them the plunder. So that's God's battle plan here. The right battle with the right weapons at the right time. So then we see, after this, the third excuse that Moses gives. In chapter 4, verse 1, Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" Which is ironic, because if you read a few verses forward, I didn't read this part yet. In chapter 3, verses 18, God tells Moses, "They will listen to your voice, you and the elders of Israel." And now he's saying, they won't listen to my voice. They're not going to believe me. Moses' insecurities are back already. So it wasn't enough. And I kind of don't blame him for this question, because if you think about what's going on so far and the conversation that Moses is supposed to have with the Israelites. So he goes to talk to the elders of Israel, and he's like, all right, so you see, I was out in the wilderness, and there was this bush, and it was burning, but it wasn't consumed. And a voice came out of the bush, and it told me to come tell you that I'm supposed to be your leader. And I imagine the elders and the leaders looking at him and like, so where were you again? You were in the sun for a long time, weren't you? I mean, what was he supposed to say? Oh, well, you just had to be there. The bush, it wasn't burning up. But notice again what God doesn't say. There's no rebuke, because Moses basically just contradicted what God just told him. And so he doesn't say, how dare you contradict me? He doesn't point back to Moses' qualifications, which we've talked about. God takes him seriously. Seriously enough to empower him with miracles. Supernatural power. These miracles will challenge the Egyptian gods and establish Moses as a prophet in front of all the people. So we've seen that the call of God comes to the prodigal. It comes with the promise that God will be with us, and it also comes with power. God gives Moses 3 miracles. I'm going to focus mostly on the first one. God asks Moses, what's that you got in your hand? And he's got a shepherd's staff with him. So the shepherd's staff is a simple tool. I mean, it's just a stick of wood that's been carved. Most shepherd's staffs probably have a crook so they can pull sheep out of crevices. It's just a stick of wood. That's it. But for a shepherd, it was a useful tool as well. He probably cut it out of a tree himself and carved it himself, probably years before. And if you've ever seen like a good walking stick that somebody's had for a long time, it get the oils on your hand, make it smooth. And it's like, you know, if you've got your favorite walking stick, it's like a part of you. It's a good tool. He uses it to help sheep. He probably used it to help protect the sheep. It's so simple. But when Moses obeyed God's command to throw it on the ground, it became a serpent. And Moses ran away from it in fear. Being out in the wilderness, he probably used that shepherd's staff to attack snakes and keep snakes away from his sheep and himself. I mean, if you're afraid of snakes, you understand this. Like you get that pole and keep the snake as far away from you as possible. And now the thing that had helped him keep the snakes away had become a snake. And God told him to grab it by its tail. And it became a rod. So some translations call it a rod. It became a rod again. And then God tells him, go and confront Pharaoh with this rod in your hand. I'm going to skip forward a few verses. In chapter 4, verse 20. So Moses has his shepherd staff at the beginning. And then before he returns to Egypt, notice what the text says in verse 20. When he goes back to Egypt, Moses took the staff of God in his hand. So this simple shepherd staff that Moses brings to the table becomes the staff of God. This is the same staff. You'll see it show up over and over again in Moses' story. Moses holds it out over the water and turns the water into blood. He holds it over the water again and the sea parts so they can walk across on dry land. He uses this staff to place judgment on the gods of Egypt. God would also use this staff to supply their needs when they're out in the wilderness and they have no water and they're grumbling again. He tells Moses to strike the rock and water will come out of the rock. So God provides their needs with this staff. It's also the staff that brought them military victory. So he holds the staff up and the army wins. So this staff is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. It's more powerful than Pharaoh. It's more powerful than multiple armies, and it's just a stick of wood. The ordinary shepherd staff becomes the staff of God. In a sermon called No Little People, No Little Places, Francis Schaeffer reflects on this part of the story. So I'm just going to read this quotation from Francis Schaeffer. Consider the mighty ways in which God used a dead stick of wood. God so used a stick of wood can be a banner cry for each one of us. Though we are limited and weak in talent, physical energy, and psychological strength, we are not less than a stick of wood. But as the rod of Moses had to become the rod of God, so that which is me must become the me of God. Then I can become useful in God's hands. Scripture emphasizes that much can come from little if the little is truly consecrated to God. There are no little people, but only consecrated and unconsecrated people. And so the problem that's set before us, all of us, is how to apply this truth to ourselves. God gives him 2 more miracles. He sticks his hand in his cloak and he comes out with leprosy. And he sticks it in again and it cures him. And then the first of the plagues that we'll cover later where he turns the water into blood. So he's equipped now with knowledge of who God is. He's equipped with signs and wonders, the staff of God. And yet this still isn't enough. Moses then points out that he's not a good speaker. This is just hilarious. And listen to how he says it. Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue. I don't know if this is supposed to be irony, but that sounds pretty eloquent to me. Most scholars actually think that Moses had a stutter, so maybe that isn't captured in the text. And I was talking to Glenn Power from Radiant Visalia. He's an amazing Bible teacher and did a lot of research on this because he's like, I don't see any evidence in the text that Moses had a stutter. Why do we believe Moses had a stutter? And so that's why you probably shouldn't disagree with all the scholars from hundreds of years who think that Moses had a stutter. They actually did a new scientific study. And they looked into Moses' background, and his parents were so closely related that parents who usually are that closely related to lead to kids with speech impediments. And he was multilingual. He knew Hebrew, he knew Egyptian, he knew Midianite, and people who know more than two languages, it's common for them to have a stutter too. So we have this psychological evidence that he probably had a stutter. So he might have been telling the truth that he's got some sort of speech impediment and he's not a good speaker. But again, notice the theme. Notice what God doesn't say to him. He doesn't say, oh, Moses, you can do this. You just need a little practice. I'll tell you what to say ahead of time, and then you can practice it, and then you won't stutter. Neither does he evaluate his speaking ability and call him out and be like, oh, yeah, you got a stutter. Like, it's pretty bad, but we can work with it. He doesn't say that either. Every step of the way, with every excuse that Moses makes, we see that it's not about Moses. It's about the God who is with him. And I love the way that the Lord responds after he says, I am slow in speech and tongue. Who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Every step of the way, God's promise is, I will be with you. And it's still not enough for Moses. And so finally, his last excuse is like, oh, Lord, please send somebody else. He has no other excuses other than just like, God, I don't want to do it. Send somebody else. And this is where we see the call of God, the kindness of God is when he calls us with partners. That we don't have to do this alone. And God's already planned this, because if you notice in the text, when he says, oh, I'm going to send Aaron with you, and he's a good speaker, Aaron was already on his way to see Moses. It's not good for us to be alone, as we see all the way back in Genesis, when God creates everything and it's amazing. And every step of the way when God creates, he says, and it was good, until he created Adam and Adam was alone. And he says, it is not good that Adam is alone. Radiant Visalia had a men's conference this weekend. And on Friday night, Eric Riley was talking about friendship. And he pointed to a 2023 study by the U.S. Surgeon General called The Epidemic of Loneliness that's in the United States now. They didn't use the term loneliness lightly. And there's all these statistics about how Americans are more lonely than ever and how they have fewer close friends. The bad part of this, I mean, it's probably obvious that if you're lonely, you're going to have psychological problems. Loneliness leads to depression and anxiety and stuff like that. The surprising part was that loneliness led to physical problems. If you're suffering from chronic loneliness, the physical effects are the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's that bad for you to be lonely. 15 cigarettes a day. So if you have a lot of friends, that doesn't mean you can start smoking. It cancels out. Don't do that. It increases, chronic loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 25%. It increases your risk of diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure. It affects not just your psychological health, it affects your physical health. And so this is why God says it's not good for you to be alone. You're not meant to go this alone. You're meant to do it together. And so God, in his kindness, doesn't make Moses do it by himself and sends his brother Aaron with him. I don't know about you. I really resonate with this story. I was talking to Celeste about it, and I'm getting choked up now. I keep getting choked up. And I'm like, why am I getting choked up at Moses' story? Why is this affecting me emotionally? And I think it's because I see myself in this story of where I've been in situations where I feel like I don't measure up. So Ralph bragged on me, like I've got some schooling and I'm a teacher. But when I was in grad school, just like all these other people in academics, I felt imposter syndrome big time. I mean, just think about it. You're in a classroom with the best and the brightest, all these geniuses. And every time I was there, I saw that there were people that were smarter than me, that worked harder than me, that knew more than me. And I felt like I didn't measure up. And luckily, I wasn't there alone. God in his providence had a partner for me. So my best friend through grad school, we shared an office together. He was a Christian too. And we would meet together and we would have, a reading assignment. Like, did you understand it? Nope. Did you? No. And so we would pray. All right, let's pray. And I'm like, for a while, I was like, I have no idea how I made it through grad school. And then I think about it. Oh yeah, I do understand how I made it through. God was with me. And I wouldn't have made it without him. And I wouldn't have made it without my friend Ben. So I resonate a lot with this. And so my question to you is, where are you with all this? Do you look around and do you see all the ways that you don't measure up? Do you see parents who are better parents than you? That are just killing it at work and they're making more money than you. And they got better stuff than you. They've got a bigger house than you. And their dogs are more obedient than your dogs. And they know the Bible more than you. And they pray better than you. And you're like, I don't even want to pray with that guy in the room. He's so much, might as well not even pray. And they worship more freely than you. All of the different ways we compare ourselves to each other. And we're never going to measure up. There's always going to be somebody who's better than you in some area. Even like the guys that win the Nobel Prize feel the same way. The question is not about our qualifications. It's not about how we measure up and what we bring to the table. Because really, we don't really bring a whole lot to the table. I mean, there's lots of gifted people that are awesome in lots of ways, but it's never going to be enough. The real question is the God who is with us and the call that he has on our life to do something in spite of our limitations, in spite of our unqualifiedness, in spite of maybe even the sins that you've committed. You're probably thinking, I know, I've thought this too, like they don't know what I've done. If they only knew the sins that I've committed, I've actually felt this thought. They would reject me. And yet Moses is in this situation. He's a murderer. Like I haven't killed anybody, so I'm like, oh, I'm better than most. But at the same time, like God doesn't call out the fact that he never mentions it. Instead, he just says, I will be with you. I've got a job for you to do, and I'm going to be with you. So in how do we apply all this to our lives? If you want to hear from God, maybe you should do some of the things that Moses did. Moses was out in the wilderness all alone, and he had no distractions. So remove distractions, go out in the wilderness, and ask God to speak to you. It's that simple. It was good enough for Jesus. All throughout the New Testament, we see he had a habit to go out into the wilderness alone to pray. And so if we want to be like Jesus, we need to do what Jesus did. Worship team, prayer team, you guys want to come? So God's call comes to the prodigal. Moses was a great man. The greatest prophet in the Old Testament, but he was deeply flawed. The cool part is that the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is worth more glory than Moses. Moses, in all of his imperfections, reminds us that there's someone better. One God raised from the dead to lead us out of our own slavery to sin. Moses had problems with words. Jesus was the perfectly revealed word. Moses was reluctant. Jesus was willing. Moses ran from a serpent in fear, and Jesus crushed the head of the serpent. So if you haven't given your life to Jesus, today is the day. God is calling the prodigals home. Give your life to him. He's calling you with a promise. Whatever battle you're facing, his promise is that he will be with you. He's calling you to be empowered by the Spirit. If you've never been empowered by the Holy Spirit, he's calling you to do that. He's calling you to partner up. We've already seen Ralph give out the invitation to join a pack. If you're not part of a pack, you're missing out on a way that God can help partner you with somebody. That's a big part of my own testimony of how I was able to overcome sin in my life, some besetting sin that I'd struggled with for years. It was through a group of guys who we looked at each other in the face and we forgot the shame and the fear, and we were just honest with each other. And he's calling us to worship him, to praise him. So look at the very end of chapter 4. We're going to close right here. Once Moses finally went back and he told the elders of Israel what was going on, what God had told him, verse 31 says, "And the people believed. And when they heard that God had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and they worshiped." The people saw that God saw them in their suffering and they worshiped. So let's come before him now. There's people that will pray for you, Ralph and Lucy. Whatever you need to pray about, whether it's putting your faith in Jesus for the first time or being empowered or whatever it is, come up for prayer. Let's worship him.